On August the 3rd, 1955, on a hot, stuffy night, British theatre was about to undergo a revolution.
Your hand.
Take it.
Come to my arms.
Your arms.
My breast.
Off we go.
How time flies when you have fun.
What do we do now?
While waiting,
While waiting.
we could do our exercises.
Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting For Godot, opened that night at the Arts Theatre in London. It immediately provoked a swirl of controversy and very nearly disappeared from the stage. Yet now the play is spoken of by some as the single greatest theatrical milestone of the 20th century. Certainly its effects have been felt on theatre around the world, and in Britain it's now seen as laying the foundations for a whole generation of playwrights in the 50s and 60s. To many it's now regarded as more influential than the work of either Harold Pinter or John Osborne. Having left his native Ireland and living in Paris, Beckett was inclined to write his plays first in French and then translate them into English, as he'd done with Godot. Until his death in December 1989, he continued to produce extraordinary work, austere, terrifying, sometimes almost unbearable, yet often grimly funny. Characters emerged from dustbins to deliver bleak, finely tuned statements of despair. In Not I, all that's seen is a jabbering mouth. The actress Billie Whitelaw regards that role as the most testing of her career, even though she'd become a close friend of the playwright who gave her endless, detailed coaching. But for the cast of the first British performance of Waiting for Godot, Paul Daneman as Vladimir, Peter Woodthorpe as Estragon, Peter Ball as Pozzo, and Michael Walker as the boy, for them there was no direct assistance. They had to rely solely on the director, 24-year-old Peter Hall. Now he and the cast recall that first encounter with the text of this theatrical landmark, Waiting for Godot, the play in which two tramps sit under a scraggy tree and wait for help which never comes.
I read it, I remember, in the break of the technical rehearsal for Morning Becomes Electra, and I read it straight through. I don't think I can possibly say that I thought, hooray, this is the masterpiece of the mid-century. I did think, though, that it was an extraordinarily interesting play because it was so lyrical, poetic, and evocative. I certainly remember responding to the fact that a playwright had, almost for the first time, it seemed to me, turned inaction into action, waiting into tension. And I also thought it was very funny. So I decided I would have a go.
Frankly, I was appalled when I got the script. I couldn't understand a word of it, and at first reading I thought that either the author or I must be potty. Yet on closer scrutiny, I couldn't help seeing that it was what is known as an original play. Pozzo and Waiting for Godot appeared to be written entirely in symbolic undertones or overtones. Contrariwise, I wasn't so silly as not to realize that it was a fat part full of fascinatingly effective things. So I hummed and hawed until Peter Hall, with diabolical cunning, suggested that I was ideal physical casting for the role. I accepted, not liking to tell him that the script had arrived with the name of the late Alexander Gage on it.
It was a pure fluke that I was in it. I was at the Old Vic at the time. The play had been sent to almost everybody. So I went home from the theatre with it under my arm, and I made myself a big pot of black coffee, sat up in bed, and started to read it, and I immediately thought that I had actually gone mad. I'd never seen a play like this before. I mean, I'd seen some pretty bad plays, but this clearly wasn't the work of a madman. But I couldn't make head nor tail of the style of the play, or what it was trying to say. It seemed to break every theatrical rule that I knew. Incidentally, I was originally intended to play Estragon, not Vladimir. I think Cyril Cusack was going to play Vladimir, and Cyril withdrew at the very last minute.
In 1955, I was appearing in a Cambridge Footlights review at the Scala Theatre in London. It was during the long vac, and I was due to return to the university in October to complete my course there. One day, the phone rang, and a lady from the Arts Theatre Club asked me if I'd like to play a tramp in a new play there. She said, or so at least I thought at the time, "He's on at the beginning of the play." I gladly accepted, thinking how kind it was of Peter Hall to give me the experience of a small part in a professional production. I didn't get the script until the day before the first reading, and found out that what the nice lady on the phone must have said was, he's on from the beginning of the play. Because Estragon, my part, was on every single page, and what's more, I didn't understand a word.
I was living in London with my parents, and this young man, Peter Hall, I'd worked with on a previous project, and he called me, and I had 2 offers at one time, which is very rare for me. It still is, but I got a call from a repertory company just outside London to do another Agatha Christie. And the great advantage of Waiting for Godot was that I could walk to the theatre and save the train fares. So I thought, on the whole, it would be the wisest thing to do. The only problem was I could not understand a word of it and thought it was some sort of joke by Peter Hall. Plays in those days sort of began with a white telephone and the maid coming in saying her ladyship should be home by tea. And you don't really start a play saying, there you are again, am I? I mean, it was just a new thing altogether. I think it was a much bigger revolution in our theatre history than even the great work of John Osborne, because he chose new subjects, but this was a new way of writing for the theatre completely.
This was a new language in the sense that it was so understated. It depended so much on premeditated, preordained pauses written in by the author, by a particular kind of mime theatre, which has always been one of Sam's extraordinary obsessions. It also was a kind of dialogue which I suppose would have held no terrors even then for, say, Morecambe and Wise, crosstalk apparently going nowhere, but which the average actor looked at and found tedious.
Peter Hall, to my astonishment, didn't even talk about it. He did say something about, if we analyse every line, we'll never open because it'll take forever. So why don't we this morning just read it? My first memory is how funny it was. And I do believe that any production of this play, the laughter should be ringing round the theatre, and also the tears, straight away as we began to read it out loud. Not knowing what it was all about really in general, but it worked. These people were real, the answers were real, and, to have a run of conversation and then an awful, bored, heavy pause and then say, that wasn't such a bad little canter. It doesn't mean anything when you look at it on the page, but the moment you read it, it came to life, and that to me is always a mark of a good play.
As we rehearsed it, I can remember the gravity of the play and not the meaning, because it doesn't have a meaning in that sense of the word, but the sort of purpose of the play began to emerge, and the poetic and sort of spiritual values of the play. And we began to find more and more that, in fact, the less we did, the better it worked. It really was a voyage of discovery.
We didn't discuss very much what the play meant. It seemed to me what the play meant was what the play was, what the play said.
I gave like a speech at the read-through, and every time we got to it after that, Peter Hall would stop and say, we'd cut that for the moment and go on, you see. And after about 2 weeks of this silence from this young man, I thought, have I offended him? Am I about to get the sack? And to me it was very remarkable, just personally, because it marked a sort of high point after which things changed in our theatre. I went to Peter Hall and I said to him on the sort of Friday, Peter, when are we going to work on this speech? And he said, well, I'm waiting for you, love. He said, I don't think it's a speech we can work on very much with the text in our hands, so when you're good and ready. And I said to Peter on the Tuesday, we were going to run the first act or something, I said, when we get to Lucky's speech, I could say it. I said the speech, and he then stopped us. He said, right, the rest of you go home. I'll be working with Timmy for 2 days.
Right, the tennis on the beer, the flames, the tears, the stones, so blue, so cool, so blue, so calm, alas, alas, on the skull, the skull, the skull, the skull in Connemara. In spite of the tennis, the labours abandoned, left unfinished, graver still, the abode of stones. In a word, I resume, alas, alas, abandoned, unfinished, the skull, the skull, the skull in Connemara. In spite of the tennis, the skull, alas, the stones, Kennard. Tennis, the stones, so calm, Kennard, unfinished!
It runs 5.5 minutes, except on the last night in Blackpool when we had to catch the night train from Preston, and it ran about 2. But I mean, basically it should run about 5.5 minutes. And I cannot learn something unless I know what it means. I found a sentence in it, which is really, it's an unfinished sentence of about 3 lines. interspersed with a sort of freewheeling thing in the mind, and then he comes back to it. I mean, the first words are given the existence of a personal God with a white beard. But even in the middle of that, there's outside time beyond extension. And then I trace through, and it sort of considers the intellectual efforts of man and the physical efforts of man, tennis, golf, And then it starts to talk about flame and fire, which I take to be a kind of final judgment. And the last word is unfinished. So it's a sort of memory and like a sort of flywheel going on.
When Peter Hall said to me, I want you to pause, and I said yes, and he said, and then I want you to pause again. I want you to go on pausing, and he described exactly what he wanted me to do. He said, pause until they start to shuffle about. And I said yes. He said, then go on pausing. Then they'll start to titter and go on pausing. And he said, when the first seat bangs, then come in, or something like that. I mean, a pause in those days in the theatre was never more than a few seconds.
I think it is true that my production of Godot, I won't say invented the pause, but elevated the pause to a very strong theatrical weapon. But I've always loved pauses. I'm a very musical director, and I think you only define words and you only define sound by silence. And I love silence in the theatre, and I love directing a scene so that a pause is there. It holds, it makes the audience ruminate, and that the actor comes out of the pause in a different state than when he went into it. I loved all that, doing Godot. But of course there was no such thing as a Pinter pause when I was doing Godot. There was no such thing as Pinter. One of the people who came to see Waiting for Godot was a young writer who sent me a play, and the letter said, "Dear Mr. Hall, here is my play. I've seen your production of Godot and liked it very much. I thought my play might interest you. Yours, Harold Pinter." And it was the birthday party. And it did interest me. And I'm sure that Godot had an extraordinary effect on Harold. I wouldn't presume to say that it inspired him, but I think it probably reassured him that his kind of theatre was valid, could operate, could work.
Peter said we must be prepared for complete disaster. He was prepared for the play to be yelled off the stage, actually. It wasn't yelled off the stage, it was frozen off, really, at the beginning. We actually had lines prepared. If anybody shouted out, Peter Wood thought he was going to say, "Did you hear anything?" And I was going to say, "No, I didn't." And then he was going to say, "Neither did I." And then we were going to go on. We weren't going to let it pass.
Say, I am happy.
I am happy.
So am I.
So am I.
We are happy.
We are happy.
Well, I'm not happy. In fact, I've never been so bored in all my life.
The first night of Godot was a very, very strange and uncomfortable experience. Very soon after it started, people began yawning audibly. Half the audience were very hostile and half were very taken. And at the end of the play, it had what is known as a mixed reception, which means that some people hated it and some people loved it. The next morning, the daily press was really dreadful. I mean, dreadful. It reported that nothing had happened, that it was boring and it was ridiculous. I remember Philip Hope Wallace in The Guardian saying that this is the sort of trash we used to see in little basements in Berlin in the 1920s, but really we ought to be moving away from this now. And it was quite terrible. The owner of the Arts Theatre called me into his office and said, "We're going to have to take the play off at the end of the week." And I said, "Please wait for the Sundays. Please."
As actors, we were exonerated. We were, they commiserated with us for having to be in this dreadful, dreadful, dreadful play. I mean, they went on and on and on about it. And we played to almost nothing. And we played on Sundays because it was a club theatre. And I didn't even bother to read the papers on Sunday morning. I had a drink or two on Saturday night and slept in on Sunday morning and thought, oh, God, how many more weeks of it? And Peter Hall had said, "I don't think we're going to make our 4 weeks or whatever." Just a friend of mine wanted a ticket for the Sunday night because it was a club, and I couldn't get through to the box office. When I finally got through, I was rather cross with them. I thought they'd taken the phone off the hook. And they said, "Well, haven't you seen the Sunday papers?"
The Arts Theatre bar in those days was haunted by a lady who was just setting out as a literary agent, Peggy Ramsey. And I said to her, "What on earth am I going to do?" Because she agreed with me of the importance of the play and the importance of Sam Beckett as a talent. And she said, "Do you not think it would be a good idea to send a copy of one of his novels round to Harold Hobson?" So I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, at least it might put it in context, because all the English critics are just looking at this as a bit of avant-garde from Paris left bank. So I dispatched to Harold Hobson, who I didn't know, my well-thumbed copy of What? I mean, only well-thumbed, I have to say, since I started rehearsing Godot, because I've been reading round my subject. Hobson's notice began, those of us last Tuesday who were waiting for Godot, most of the audience were rather bewildered, but those of us who are acquainted with What understood how we were to take this. So that saved the day. But I don't want to mock Harold, because he championed the play.
In those days, dramatic critics had much more authority than they do now. Hobson in the Times was a sort of god, really. And the result was you couldn't get in. And the same people, I have to say, a lot of the same people who'd walked out on the first night were there again and would come round and say, "Oh, how very interesting, do tell me." But nevertheless, it's the way the arts work in a free society. That's how it happens. And very often the fashionable and perhaps the, if one puts it cynically, the rather sort of affected and trendy, do in fact very often lead us in the right direction. I mean, there's no doubt they did. And the result was enough people came for the play to be established as what it was, which was a classic.
New steps in the arts are always very, very disturbing for anybody, particularly critics, who by definition must be immersed in the present. And it takes quite a broad mind and a flexible scope, I would have said, to respond to something which questions the very nature of theatre, that questions the very nature of what a play is. My own belief is that it remains the undisputed masterpiece of the mid-century theatre, world theatre. I think there's absolutely no question about it. It didn't seem possible, though, to make such a statement on that Wednesday morning after the first night. It didn't even seem possible after we got the two reasonable Sunday notices. But, of course, it became a fashionable, controversial success. I mean, people argued about it, walked out of it, abused it. People did cartoons about it. It was extraordinary. It was a sort of Godot fever developed.
Sam Beckett came to see us in London. We'd been, by this time, an established success in a West End theatre. He made some comments, I think, to Peter Hall. He gave a sheaf of notes, which Peter Hall said, "I'm not going to read you." But he said one of the things, Beckett said, that all the pauses were too short, because we were having pauses of a mere 1.5 minutes, and he wanted 4. And Peter Hall said to him, apparently, "But Sam, if we pause that long, the audience will leave." And he says it doesn't matter.
Sam Beckett was perhaps a little bit difficult like that. I mean, I always felt a little bit, I always heard afterwards that he didn't really approve of our production, but I don't know when he saw it. I did meet him, but we didn't talk about the play, of course. We talked about cricket, which seemed to interest him most. But I always thought it was a little bit unfair to have given Peter Hall no help at all and said it means what you want it to mean, and not any kind of direction at all, and then afterwards to complain about the production. Later on, he was much more specific. Billy Whitelaw, he used to write to continually to tell her exactly how to do everything. How interesting it would have been if he'd done that with us.
I spent an arrogant evening on my part with him as a young actor. I presumed to discuss with him what I thought the play was about. I pointed out to him that as far as I could understand it, for every one literary reference, of which there are a great many, there were about 3 from the Bible, and whatever he said about Mr. Godot not being God, it says in my speech, "Given the existence of God with a white beard." And at the end of the play, "Has he a beard, Mr. Godot? What colour is it?" "White, sir. Christ have mercy on us." So I said, "You're stuck with that." And I talked to him about, you've got this view for me in the play of a God who once cared, once loved, sent his son to the cross, the tree, cursed be everyone that hangs on a tree and all that. And you've pictured a God who, that was all true once, but he's got tired of waiting and he now does nothing, sir. Peter Hall once said to me about that line, "He does nothing, so it's the most terrifying line in contemporary theatre." And I said all this to him with terrible arrogance, I'm afraid, and he said, "Well, Timothy, if that's what you think the play is about, I expect that's what it's about." But he wouldn't give away any more, and I don't think it is what the play's about. So I think that's a strand in it.
There was a part of Sam, I'm sure, but which rather enjoyed being an outsider and a rebel. And I think with this play, which was the first time he really became famous in the sense. I mean, he was known in intellectual circles in Paris and London beforehand, but hardly known. And this play made him world famous. And I think, in a way, he hadn't come to terms with the power it gave him for somebody who'd elected to live almost like a tramp. I mean, Peter said when he met him in Paris, I mean, the set was a table and a chair and a dusty window and Sam Beckett, you know.
I was told years later by Harold Hobson that I had invented the fact that it was about two tramps. I can only say they always were two tramps to me. I wasn't even conscious of having made that decision. When I read the play, they were two tramps who ate carrots and roots and odd bits of rubbish and sat under a tree all day.
What it is, of course, it's like so many great plays, great situation comedies and all the rest of it. It's the married couple. Vladimir and Estragon are like a married couple. Only they're a married couple in space. They're a married couple who've been together for thousands of years, perhaps, I don't know. But the basis of their humour and the basis of the reaction is that eternal sort of married thing of we can't do without each other, we need each other, but we can't bear each other. All that goes on throughout the play. And I think that if that is followed in the play, if the actors follow that, the cosmic side of it takes care of itself. And I think we didn't really discover that completely by the time we opened, but we were a great deal nearer to that on opening night.
Another story I always tell about Godot is in the second act, Vladimir, played by Paul Daneman, has a long philosophic dissertation, very, very difficult for the actor to sell to the audience. And Paul said to me, I can't do this with my bowler hat on. This is the dress rehearsal. And I said, well, don't see why not. He said, I just can't. I mean, my head's bursting. So I said, well, we'll find a place where you take your hat off. Let's run it again. He began running it. And he got to the line, Christ have mercy upon us. And I said, that's it, take your hat off, put it on your lap. Right, he said, and he took it off and put it on his lap. About 4 weeks after we'd opened, Hobson, who was writing about Godot regularly, wrote a whole piece about a particularly Christian moment when Paul took his hat off and said, Christ have mercy upon us. I went in to see Paul that Sunday night, because we used to play on Sundays at the Arts. And Paul said to me, I can't take my hat off now. He said, I thought I was just taking my hat off. I didn't know it had this significance. He said the entire audience will be waiting for this great moment.
Please, Mr. Albert.
Off we go again. Do you not recognize me?
No, sir.
It wasn't you who came yesterday?
No, sir.
This is your first time?
Yes, sir.
You have a message from Mr. Godot?
Yes, sir.
He won't come this evening.
No, sir.
But he'll come tomorrow.
Yes, sir.
Without fail.
Yes, sir.
What does he do, Mr. Godot? Do you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Well?
He does nothing, sir.
Has he a beard, Mr. Godot?
Yes, sir.
Fair or black?
I think it's white, sir.
Christ have mercy on us.
What am I to say to Mr. Godot, sir?
Tell him you saw me and that you saw me. You're sure you saw me? You won't come back and tell me tomorrow that you never saw me before?
They are star parts. Star parts in the sense of the French idea of the acteur as opposed to the comédien, where the actor's own personality fills out the role. Like all great parts, just like Hamlet, you know, there are probably as many Vladimirs as there are actors.
Both physically and mentally, it was a disturbing play with which to be associated. The bleakness and sordidity of the set and the clothes, the smell, the spitting and the drooling, all of which formed part of the pattern, had a most depressing effect on me, and I'd come to dread going to the theatre. And it didn't help me at this stage in my portrayal to learn that Pozzo represented fascism, communism, Lord Beaverbrook, Randolph Hearst, Mussolini, James Joyce, or, rather surprisingly, Humpty Dumpty.
One had to actually get them to trust words, a bit as you have to get actors to trust words in Shakespeare. We live in a non-verbal society where words are used as a means of masking our feelings rather than expressing them. And the theatre of Maugham and Coward and Rattigan and even the theatre of Chekhov and Ibsen, is to some degree based on the fact that you don't say what you think, you don't say what you feel, you use the words in order to disguise what you feel. Beckett was exploring stating feeling to some degree. Not always, but quite often. And in that sense, I think Beckett is the first genuinely poetic dramatist that we've had since Chekhov and Ibsen. And Beckett was using words metaphorically again, which to me was a tremendous excitement. And it opened the gates for Pinter, even for Osborne, for Arden, for Bond. I mean, it's brought words back to the theatre, what Sam did.
Then adieu.
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 And thank you.
Thank you.
Not at all.
Yes, yes.
No, no.
Yes, yes.
I don't seem to be able to depart.
Such is life.
You're going the wrong way.
I need a running start. Stand back! On!
On, on!
On, on!
Faster! On! Adieu!
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 Up, big! On! Faster! On! Adieu! Big! Yep! Adieu!
That passed the time.
It would have passed in any case.
Yes. But not so rapidly.
I would love to do Godot again. In fact, it is an ambition of mine, before I hang up my clogs, to do it again. In saying that, I don't have a theory, I want to do this with Godot. I would just like to go and experience it again with 4 actors and find out what it means to me today. One of the great privileges about being a director is that you're paid to spend weeks inside a masterpiece, which is just great. It's a wonderful way of actually getting to know them. And of all the plays I've done, and I've done a couple of hundred, although Godot is 40 years ago, it's absolutely present in the forefront of my mind because it was such a blinding experience. I don't mean that I can remember how I did it, because I can't, or how the actors behaved, or how we rehearsed, because I can't. But then I don't remember those sort of things anyway. They're part of the work process. But I do remember the play, and its strange, luminous humour, and its strange pessimism. I mean, it's a great, tragic play about living, and I don't think you can ask much more of a play. What is it like to be alive, waiting for death?